TV shows, we all love them. Drama, romance, horror, action, thriller, suspense, there's something there for everyone. Great stories that everyone can sit down and watch and be entertained by. However, some TV shows, they keep going and they don't have an end in sight and they keep going on and on and on. They can sometimes actually ruin a TV show. So I'm going to go through some TV shows today which I think outstayed their welcome and just didn't know when to call it quits. Because as they say, all good stories must come to an end. Eventually. As of recording, there are 32 seasons and almost 700 episodes. The Simpsons is one of the longest running TV shows ever. I think it is the longest running animated show ever. And it's crazy, both in terms of what's on the show and just the idea of the fact that it's been going on for 32 seasons. Now, at one point when I was younger, back in those days, the show was pretty good, if not great, but then the quality did drop. And I couldn't tell you where the quality is right now, but I can almost guarantee you it's not as good now as it was 20 years ago. So will The Simpsons ever end? I know popularity, while not as high as it once was, is still pretty good. It doesn't look like there's an end in sight for The Simpsons, and maybe it's time for the yellow-bellied Simpsons to call it a day. I could give you 13 reasons why this TV show went on too long, but that's a terrible joke, so I won't bother. Instead, I will just say that 13 Reasons Why was a good, if not great, TV show for one season. It was based on a book. Each episode was a pivotal part of the book, focusing on a different character. And it felt like it was well-rounded, it felt like it was well-developed, well-made, well-crafted story. Only, the story ended at the end of the first season. But because of the success of the show, because of how popular it was, Netflix brought it back for another season. And then another season. Only these two seasons weren't based on books because the books didn't exist. And there really wasn't a good enough reason for these next two seasons to exist. How could you continue the story when the main character was dead? Well, they found a way of bringing back the main character in season 2, but at that point it started to get a bit more fantastical, a bit more silly. Ultimately, we watched the first season of 13 Reasons Why and ignored the rest. The main star was fired. Something about tiger blood or something, I don't know. And then, one of the other main stars left the show because he didn't like the show. So at which point, they brought in Ashton Kutcher, hoping to reinvigorate it. Only it didn't quite work out that way. And at that point, the show was less Two and a Half Men and just two men. Ultimately, though, Two and a Half Men was sexist, misogynistic, and just really offensive at times. It was also very repetitive in terms of the storylines that it told. So the fact that it went on long enough that it even recast one of its main characters and continued without the main star and so on is saying something.
Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state that nearly 14 billion years ago expansion started. Wait, the earth began to cool, the autotrophs began to drool, Neanderthals developed tools, we built a wall. We built the pyramids, math, science, history, unraveling the mystery that all started with a big bang.
11 seasons. 11 seasons, which, if you look at the later half of the series, it's very different from the early half of the series. The series started being about geek and nerd culture, focusing on geeks and nerds. It was a real revelation to see other types of representation in TV, especially when, up to that point, geeks and nerds had been maligned and basically treated as comedic relief and were looked down upon in various TV shows and films. So to see them at the front and centre was really quite good. Only after a while it became pretty clear that The Big Bang Theory was less about geek and nerd culture and more about poking fun at geek and nerd culture. It was jokes at the expense of that fan base. And then they started introducing new characters into the show to change the dynamic up a bit. The show went on and on and on. They started to get repetitive. They started to get more silly storylines, things that just didn't really make much sense. Like one of the characters ended up going into space. Ultimately though, the first few seasons were actually alright, but then the quality dropped. It started to get repetitive. They did try to rekindle it a bit in the last few seasons, but it never. 7 of The Office USA, Steve Carell, the main character and the big name star attached to the show, left. Now, at that point you're thinking, right, 7 seasons, the main character's leaving, let's just call it a day, let's end it there. But no, they continued. In fact, they continued that very season when he left. And the whole storyline at that point was like, who's going to replace him? The other thing at that point is that many of the storyline arcs, the romance story with Jim and Pam, the various other relationships, the various other character storylines, were all coming to an end, it seemed. And they were all running out of steam at the very least. So season 7 really would have been a good time for everyone to call it a day. But they introduced new characters, they kept the show going, they changed the hierarchy a bit, they changed who was in charge, and the show never went bad, but it definitely declined in quality the moment Steve Carell left. And there were 2 more seasons without Steve Carell. The final season did try to bring things back up a little bit, but it didn't quite get there. About halfway through Friends, it became very clear that the writers were running out of ideas. The characters, for example, stopped being 3-dimensional human beings and started being cartoon characters. Why does Joey always want to eat? Why is Jennifer Aniston's character like really self-obsessed? Why is Ross just a really horrible person? That's basically what these characters ended up being in a nutshell towards the later end of the seasons. And they also started to introduce weird storylines like Joey and Rachel and having a relationship. Okay, why didn't that get hinted at way earlier in the show? Why did that come out of nowhere? There were a bunch of other things in there as well though. But as a comedy, of course, the biggest problem was that it became less and less funny as it went on. And a bit more simplistic and less smart, less intelligent. Friends eventually did end, had a pretty good season finale, but the later seasons are not as good as the earlier ones. You might see in this show that I'm doing right now, there's a bit of repetition here. The shows that tend to go on longer end up getting worse. Topher Grace and Ashton Kutcher, the two probably the biggest names and stars of that 70s show, left prior to the final season. Ashton Kutcher did come into the final season for a few episodes to wrap out his storyline and character arc, and Topher Grace did reprise his role very briefly in one scene in the final episode. But you had 2 of the biggest stars leaving the show, and yet the show went on. Topher Grace, by the way, was the main character. This show was all about him and his friends and how he relates to them. So you get rid of him, who's the main character now and what's this show actually about? I don't think they knew either. They tried to introduce a new character, but he never quite clicked, he never quite vibed with everyone else going on. They tried to change the formula a little bit, change who the main characters were, but it's also worth saying that the show's quality did drop in that final season. Hell, it was dropping a little bit leading up to the final season as well. That 70s show, I think, is a good show overall. The final season does have its moments, but it just was a bit of a different show at that point, and it was the right time to end. You could say this show was so modern it failed to keep with the times, if that makes sense. I'm not convinced it does, but anyway, Modern Family went on too long. The first 2 seasons of Modern Family were great. From that point onwards, it was mostly good, mostly okay. Towards the back end of the series though, there were actually times when the show was flat out bad. And they were getting very repetitive. Like other TV shows I've mentioned today, some of the characters started to become a bit one-note, repetitive and stereotypical. And for a show being about a family, it feels like there was a bit of a missed opportunity in there in that they never lost any family members. There was one incident towards the later end of the season where they teased it, and then it turns out actually it's a character we didn't really know that well. But the characters were getting older. The child actors, as they started off in the show, ended up being adults by the end of the show, and they just kind of lost their charm. That goes for all the characters, not just the child actors. The comedy dropped, the quality dropped. There were still some really good moments throughout the run, even in the worst seasons towards the end. Ultimately, Modern Family was a reflection of a certain time period. Once that time period was over, the show just kept going on, and it didn't need to. Now, one of the greatest comedies ever made that was brought back from the dead, only to fail to match earlier seasons. It's Arrested Development. So, one of the greatest comedies ever made ended up being a joke of itself. Yes, Arrested Development, the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development are one of the best comedy shows ever made. Period, hands down. I don't know how well it holds up, I haven't watched them in a while, but I remember them being some of the best comedy ever. Then, after several years off because the show was cancelled, Netflix brought it back. Only at this point, all the actors were in a different place and time because some were doing films, some were doing other TV shows, some had other commitments. So they couldn't get together at the same time and do the show the same way anymore. So what happened was they had to change how they did the show. It was no longer about them as an ensemble, it was them as an individuals, weaving in and out of each other's storylines. And it didn't really work, it lost its charm. A lot of the comedy, a lot of the connections between the characters just was broken. Hell, there are moments in the Netflix revival where you can clearly see that they're not actually talking to each other. That it's people standing in front of a green screen with body doubles mimicking the back of people's heads because that actor couldn't be there at the time, so they had to get someone else to be in there as well. So they were literally doing the same scene in 2 different, completely different locations and then editing them together. It was weird, it was noticeable, it wasn't very well done. And then they done another season, which was a little bit of an improvement. They also re-edited that first Netflix season to make it a bit more like the original 3 seasons, and that was also a little bit of an improvement. But at that point, the comedy had gone a little stale. It was a little old hat kind of thing. The show had outstayed its welcome at that point, and hopefully at this point, the show is just kind of over. There is room for more in terms of storyline wise, but I don't really want it. What happens when you break out of prison? Well, Of course, you have to get arrested again so you can break out of another prison. And in your spare time, you need to take down some sort of government division that's involved in some sort of conspiracy theory. Why not? Prison Break continued to get sillier and more convoluted as it went on. The first 2 seasons were great. Then the 3rd season came along, there was a writer's strike, which really messed things up a bit. They had to then go way crazier, way grander with their ideas, and the show kind of just lost the plot a bit. It was meant to be about rescuing his brother, who was in prison, just getting him out there. For some reason they had to go down the whole conspiracy theory route, they had to involve the government and different divisions of it, and it just went weird and bizarre. Then at one point they killed off one of the main characters only for the next season to bring them back to life, and then they did it again with some other characters later on. I mean, storytelling 101, if you kill a character, don't bring them back. And that goes doubly so if you kill multiple characters. But anyway, the show did come to an end eventually. The end was actually okay. It wrapped up all the storylines and character arcs. And then several years later, they brought it back again for one more season. And they did it again. They brought back characters from the dead. And they tried to continue the show, and they gave it yet another finale to end things on a bit of a happier note, let's say. This show really didn't know when to call it quits. So those are the examples that I wanted to talk about TV shows that went on too long. Some of them did come to an end eventually, thank God. Others, like The Simpsons, are still going on. Fingers crossed they do eventually see some sense and come to a halt. I'm sure I've missed some TV shows on there which you think have went on too long, so let me know in the comments and feedback down below what you think have went on too long. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @TheUnderscoreGrantBurton to get all my thoughts and opinions as I get them. Most importantly though, subscribe to my channel. The more subscribers I get, the more content like this you will get. And of course it just means a lot to me in the meantime. Otherwise, that's all for now. So thanks for watching.